Okay, I'm back here with my friend Tremper Longman, and probably a lot of you watching this watched the previous video where we talked about the age of creation. And so, if you haven't watched that, I would recommend going back and doing that. It kind of gives you an introduction to just kind of the bigger picture of some of the issues between the Bible and science as it pertains to Genesis 1 and 2. For this video, I want to talk specifically about whether or not Adam in Scripture is a literal historical individual. Tremper, I don't even know what you're going to say here. This is so awesome. I kind of knew what you're going to say about the creation story, but is Adam a literal historical figure?
Yes and no.
You should run for office.
You were introducing it, you said individual, and then I would have said no. But this time, you simply said is. So here's what I think. And if we talked a little bit about this in the last one, I think a sensitive reading of Genesis 1 to 11 understands that it is theological history. That is, it is making historical claims about things that happened in the past. And I call it theological history because rather than economic history or military history, the emphasis is on God and his relationship with his human creatures. That's where the focus is. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think myth is a inappropriate term to use in relation to Genesis 1 to 11. You can make a case for it because myths can be true. They can even be historically true, but but I don't think it's a good term, partly because of the contemporary understanding of myth as kind of like fiction and made up stories. So it's not myth. And then, sometimes, like Wayne Grudem in a recent chapter of book that he wrote in a book that he edited, which was a critique of theistic evolution, he sets it up that way. It's either myth or it's straightforward history, and it's kind of like you're setting up a straw person there. Yeah. So my point is it's talking about real historical events, but it's using figurative language to talk about this historical events, because while the biblical author and ultimately God, who's the ultimate author of Scripture, is interested in communicating to us in these chapters that God created everything, including human beings, he's not interested in telling us how he did it. But yes, there is a historical reality behind the description of the creation of Adam and Eve. But I don't think that should necessarily lead us to conclude that Adam and Eve are the first two Homo sapiens that sort of appeared out of nothing or emerged out of an evolutionary process. So there is a historical, and so theologians and biblical scholars like myself and N.T. Wright, who's written about this, and Pete Enns and Dennis Alexander, John Walton has talked about this. As we think about it, what we might imagine that Adam and Eve are, say, two individuals that are chosen out of a larger group. Because one of the additional issues that it's not just evolutionary creationism, but the way evolution works and the way what our genes are presently telling us, according to my geneticist friends like Francis Collins and Dennis Venema and Jeff Schloss, is that there never was a time when there were two Homo sapiens and only two Homo sapiens on the earth. That at the very beginning of Homo sapiens, which is somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, there were, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. So So what the Bible teaches clearly is that God created everything, including human beings. I think the story of Genesis 2 is not the story of the origins of Homo sapiens, but rather is the story that begins when God chooses either a group or two specific individuals to endow them with the status of being his image bearers. And this is very close, if not identical, to views held in the past generation by John Stott and Derek Kidner.
Wow.
And they refer to the Adam and Eve story as the story of Homo divinus, story. And that's connected with the now pretty broadly consensus view that when you talk about the image of God, you're not talking about attributes. You're talking about a status. Right. You represent me in my creation.
Right.
And then you can see both priestly and royal language in Genesis 2, that Adam and Eve are priests in God's earthly sanctuary, Eden. But they also, they're also commissioned to rule and subdue the earth as God's kind of vice kings in the area, in the world.
So you would say Genesis or Adam and Eve then aren't like composite representative figures, but rather they were selected out of a group of Homo sapiens to be. Or...
Yeah, I think that. I think that's the view favored by, say, Tom Wright.
Okay.
And I think he articulates that and surprised by scripture. But also, I've heard him lecture a lot. Matter of fact, one of the coolest panels I was ever on was me representing the Old Testament, Tom representing the New Testament, and Francis Collins representing biology.
Oh gosh,
that was, I learned a lot from that one.
Wow.
So, but another view is that God endowed a group to be his image bearers.
Okay.
And so there are and there's some variability as to when that might have happened. So the Bible teaches some things very clearly that we stand by, that as we say, who created human beings and all creatures, it's God, but not how he did it, nor necessarily when this happened. So we could speculate.
Yeah.
Some people think it was like 12,000 years ago. Other people think 30,000 years ago. To get into the weeds, I will once again promote my book. Confronting Old Testament controversies, pressing questions about evolution, sexuality, history, and violence. But my contention would be that I won't be able to spell out in the brief time we have together, is that such a view does not compromise important doctrines like our creation, the fact that we were created, but that at the moment God conferred Adam and Eve with the status of being image bearers, that they were morally innocent, that sin and death, as Paul says in Romans, entered on the heels of that first original sin, and that sin affects us today. Now, where I would disagree with some is that I don't think that the way Adam and Eve's sin affects us today is through genetics. In other words, we don't inherit sin like a genetic disease, but rather, first of all, Adam and Eve did what we would all do in their situation, A, and then B, that original sin so disrupted the cosmic and social order that it's impossible not to sin.
Yeah. So,
So,
so would you say the way Genesis 2, because I mean,
right,
the way Genesis 2 is describing the creation of Adam and Eve, it certainly is a little weird. I mean, taken from the side of Adam and the the Genesis 2:7 that you reference. God out of the dust of the ground and breathing life. There seems to be at least some figurative images going on here, and yet it does seem, I don't know, like, again, going back to what I said in the last video, if we knew from genetics, if Francis
oh,
Collins
right,
said, oh, clearly humanity came from one couple.
yeah, yeah,
And this is a little bit different than how we framed it last time, because you would say Genesis 1 doesn't give us an
yeah,
age of the earth.
oh, right, right,
But if the science did say we came from one human pair,
yeah,
then you would say then that's probably what Genesis is getting at,
yeah.
right? Or
Well, no, I would say yeah. So I don't know whether I actually articulated this phrase in our first time together, but I do think, based on that two book theology,
yeah,
that science can help us read the Bible better. In other
okay,
words, the Bible could support either of those views
right,
because it's not interested in telling us about that, but it would be compatible with either of those views.
yeah,
So in this case, if the science did show that we all went back to a single couple,
uh-huh.
then yeah, um, that would be compatible with the Bible as
Yeah.
well.
So in
But
your,
but
go ahead.
well, yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I also want to highlight the fact that these figurative depictions of the creation of Adam and Eve, who's not called Eve yet, but
Right, 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 right.
but um, but I think canonically we would make that connection. So is a figurative depiction in order to teach us important things, like Genesis 2:7. First of all, is teaching us that human beings are part of creation. Yeah, we are animals like other animals, but we have a special relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And then another dimension of it comes out if we read it in its ancient context, because the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, the Babylonian creation stories, talk about the first human beings being created from the clay
Mm-hmm.
and the blood of a demon god into which all the gods spit. So you could see that's a rather contemptible view of human beings being communicated by
Mm-hmm.
that idea. And then when we look at the creation of Eve from the side, it's showing mutuality
Mm-hmm.
between the man and the woman, not from his head, not from his feet.
Mm-hmm.
They are equals. They are mutual. So it's they're not random figures. They are teaching us
Yeah.
important things about our relationship to God, our relationship to each other.
So going back, so Adam and Eve selected out of this group of Homo sapiens. Are the rest of the Homo sapiens, what happened to them? Are they don't bear God's image, or are these questions we just don't have an answer to?
Yeah,
Um,
there are questions that are important to think about, especially for theologians, and but there's no certain answers to it.
yeah.
But they're important questions to ask, and there are different scenarios. As a matter of fact, there's a book that I hope comes out soon, written by Lauren Harzma.
Hmm. Oh yeah.
Deb Harzma, who's the president of BioLogos' husband, is a physicist, and the book, which I've read, is shows different possible scenarios. That demonstrate there's more. I guess what I'm saying is there's more than one way to make the
Yeah.
Bible and science compatible,
Yeah.
not just one way. And then on a more kind of a more another interesting idea has been floated by a geneticist, Christian geneticist from Washington University in St. Louis, Joshua Swamidass, where he argues that evolution happened like evolution happens, but that about 12,000 years ago, God did specially create a couple, Adam and Eve,
Oh.
but then started intermarrying with others, so that by the time you come to Jesus, everybody is genealogically related. His book's called The Genealogical Adam.
Huh.
I love Josh, he's brilliant, but I have some serious reservations about this thesis. But it's certainly worth those who want to explore in this area to take a look.
So when I go to the history museums and they show the evolution of humanity and these kind of pre-humanoid, I know nothing. I mean, there's all kinds of classes and names.
Right.
You would say all that's totally legit. I mean, my kids were asking me like, they were getting kind of weirded out, because I don't know this discussion, and they're like, "Wait, is this true? Is this what about Adam and Eve and all this stuff?" I'm like, "I don't know. Let me talk to Tremper and Uncle Tremper." And but you would say that all that's like, no, that's pretty much yes, that's the way it went down.
Well, actually, speaking of which, I was in a meeting 2 days ago, and one of the other people in this small meeting was the person who put together the history of human origins at the Smithsonian, which I haven't seen yet, but I hear it's brilliant. And my Christian friends who have seen it said, it really reflects contemporary science. And she's a Christian too. And she's excited because she heard that I'm on the advisory council and to have a science Bible exhibit at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., which is going to deal with more than just evolution, but it's going to deal with other sciences as well. But it was going to open in November, but will being delayed because of the COVID till spring, we hope. And but for those of you who are listening who get to DC after it opens, I can tell you it's going to be an incredible exhibit. The Museum of the Bible is an incredible place to visit, period, here in Washington, D.C. So bottom line is I won't vouch for every permutation of these theories, but generally speaking, it seems reasonable. And Preston, one of the reasons why I think this question has come up again, particularly over the past 20 years, is because of the sequencing of the human genome.
Right.
And so we're learning an awful lot that are raising, I think, interesting questions, which I personally don't feel threatened by, like the fact that you and me, being descendants of people from Europe, have about 2 to 4% Neanderthal genetic matter in us, and people from various parts of Asia have Denisovan genetic material. Huh. So there's all kinds of interesting questions.
Can you real quick, for somebody who has no clue what the Human Genome Project was? I mean, I just barely know. Can you real lay level overview of what went down a couple years ago? Yeah.
Well, it'll have to be real lay level, but and it's Francis Collins, who's the head of this project. He's now the head of the National Institutes of Health. He's Tony Fauci's boss, but he also is the founder. He's the founder of BioLogos. And indeed, maybe the best thing I could say is go to the biologos.org webpage, where you will find people like Francis Collins explaining this.
Okay. Yeah.
But basically, it's looking at our genetic code, and I better just leave it at that. As I said at the beginning of the last session, I'm not a scientist, so I don't want to make a fool of myself. But I can tell you that that's one important line, along with other important lines that demonstrate that we do have common ancestry with other primates and other creatures.
Oh, okay. So that's been, you would say that's not a theory. It's not one view. I mean, it's pretty much, it's 2 + 2 = 4 kind of, maybe not quite that much, but.
Well, I think what people should understand is theories. We sometimes use theory as a kind of like, that's our best guess, right?
Yeah.
In science, a theory always remains a theory. It never graduates to, say, a law. The difference is, are there well-evidenced theories or are there less well-evidenced theories? And quoting Francis Collins again, he says there's more evidence in favor of evolution than there is for gravity.
Really?
So
Wow.
that's what we mean by a strongly evidenced theory.
Wow.
And so I do encourage all your listeners to explore. So biologos, you'll find scientists like Collins and Schloss and Venema and Schwamadas. You'll find pastors like Tim Keller talking about this issue, John Ortberg, and others. You'll find biblical scholars like me and John Walton and Richard Middleton and N.T. Wright and others. So if you're interested in this, that's a really great resource to go to. And it's not just, it started really, I'm paraphrasing its mission statement, but it's kind of like make the evangelical world safe for evolutionary creationists. It's not trying to convert people, but it's more like saying, hey, you know what? We're actually Christians. We're not going to hell, at least for that. Okay. So,
what would you say? Yeah. So Biologos, I've been on there a few times, not recently, but it really helpful, clear, and high quality stuff. The videos and just really great stuff. Again, great stuff. Even if you don't agree or you just want to explore it, it's kind of the go-to place. What do you say about the Genesis 3 and Romans 5 says that death was introduced through the sin of Adam. So how do we have death happening, assuming death was happening for many thousands of years before Adam?
Right. So I would suggest that it's talking about human death, and more specifically, death of, if Homo divinus had not sinned.
Okay. There
would not have been death in Homo divinus's experience. It's not talking about animal death.
Okay.
And animal death would include pre-Homo divinus Homo sapiens, in my mind.
Okay.
There's a really good book written by a Seventh-day Adventist pastor. After he wrote this book, I'm not so sure he's still a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, but it's an excellent book. Because Seventh-day Adventists, you go back to the beginning of the night, and I love, first of all, some of the Old Testament people I most respect are Seventh-day Adventist scholars, but on this point, I think they're wrong. Okay, they're mostly, if not all, young Earth creationists.
Okay.
And indeed, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, because at the end of the 19th, after Darwin, there were some negative reviews from Christians, but a Christian, again, like B.B. Warfield, said, you know what, if we're talking about God acting through his providence, that is through secondary causes, then evolution can be compatible with the Bible. Okay? But it was really at the beginning of the 20th century as part of a culture war where certain Seventh-day Adventists and dispensationalists, theologians, started pressing a more literalistic reading of Genesis that came into conflict with the Bible.
Okay.
Indeed, you would know that the term fundamentalist comes from a book that was published around there called The Fundamentals.
The Fundamentals, yeah.
But what people might not know is that there are 3 articles on science in that book, and 2 of them are pro-evolution.
Really?
Yeah. So
you are a fundamentalist.
I'm a fundamentalist in the sense that I affirm the 5 fundamentals. Yes. But I'm not a fundamentalist if that means reading Genesis in that kind of flat way.
Yeah. So if I'm just being honest, like when I hear you talk about the age of the earth in Genesis 1, I'm like, that makes sense. Like
right.
With the Adam stuff, that it does feel a little more, not you, but just the view, like we are trying to cram. We're like, we got a bit more of a burden to try to make Genesis 2 and 3 fit the scientific evidence. Where Genesis 1, I'm with you. It doesn't sound like we're trying to make it's just that Genesis 1 isn't interested in that. Would you agree with that? That this says a little bit like,
Well,
ooh, we're kind of
there's no question, but that this issue is more controversial, more complex,
yeah.
a little bit, yeah. But I don't think I don't think you should read the idea that we don't have kind of a pat set sort of way of harmonizing the two. Rather, we have 8 or 10 different ways.
yeah.
That as a, especially when we remember that the Bible isn't interested in telling us that. And we have this, what I think is obviously figurative depiction of the first. You do get. A lot of people point to the fact that Genesis 4, Cain's afraid of all these people.
Yeah.
Who they marry.
So that does actually fit better with the.
Yeah. That what I'm saying is you're not getting a neat. The other view has questions it has to answer too.
Right.
Yeah. It's not like, if it's just plain sense, straightforward history.
Right.
There are other questions, like where is this Eden place?
Well, one more thing, Tremper, and I'll let you go. So Garden of Eden. So the description of the location of the Garden of Eden. You got 4 rivers. You have really kind of going out of your way to describe a real geographical, seemingly historical place. Would you agree with that, or do you think that argument is overplayed, or are these two different questions? What historicity?
No, I think actually it's not as straightforwardly obvious that it's a historical place. In that you have a mention of 4 rivers, right? The Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pishon, and the Gihon. And it says that the rivers flow out of there, right?
Right.
So it does, yeah. So the Gihon we know as a stream in Jerusalem. Tigris and Euphrates flow out of Armenia to the Persian Gulf. The Pishon, we have no idea what that is. A friend of mine, Dick Averback, very fine Old Testament scholar, has made this argument. He goes, it mentions the Tigris and Euphrates. These are real rivers. This has to be historical. And then I remind him of something called mimesis. Mimesis is a literary term that talks about how, and I'm not equating Genesis 3 with out and out fiction, because I've already said there is a historical reference here. But even, say, a historical fiction will use real rivers, real cities to create a, so that's an argument that you want to pay. I want to and do pay attention to, but I don't find it pushing me toward a more straightforward reading.
Well, it would be similar to like the parable of the Good Samaritan or something, where just parables in general will draw on real trade routes and okay.
That's a better example than I can use. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I know probably a lot of people watching are going to completely disagree, be outraged, whatever. So, but that's these are conversations we need to have, and I would say whichever view you hold, make sure you give a charitable, fair, listening to the other side, because and the big point that I will be black and white on is there's solid Bible believing, solid Christians on both sides of this. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure BioLogos was really excited to get Tim Keller's name on there, because most people would see him as like, this is kind of like if we have a Billy Graham kind of figure, he would be the closest. So yeah, anyway, I'm still wrestling with it, man. I don't have, especially the Adam one. I just need to do a lot more thinking and research on it. So you've helped me in that journey. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Preston.
All right. Take care.